Good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you tried hacking, those of you who were here last week to hear Jesse Hirsch. That was an amazing talk, and tonight we have Rianka Singh. My name is Denny Manchi. I'm a member of the program committee for NLC, and I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture in this series, Our Digital Future. First, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we're located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. We respectfully acknowledge that the Williams Treaties First Nations have been stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters, and that today remain vigilant over their health and integrity for generations to come. We are all treaty people. And now to our speaker, Dr. Rianka Singh. Rianka is assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at York University. She was hired as one of the inaugural faculty at York's new Markham campus, which just opened recently. And she holds a PhD from U of T's Faculty of Information. Her research is primarily concerned with the relationship between platforms and feminist politics. And you're going to hear about that tonight. She's currently completing a book on the topic, tentatively titled Platform Feminism and the Politics of Elevation. Sounds abstract, but she's going to bring it down to earth. This winter, she's been teaching a course called Advanced Issues, Digital Media and Culture. So it's right on with our theme. And just fun fact, Rianka is a keen fan of women's basketball, really happy to have the new women's team in Toronto, and she's been following the March Madness mayhem south of the border. So welcome, Rianka.
Everyone here? Not too loud? Okay. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the Northumberland. Am I still on? Oh, wow. Okay. The Northumberland Learning Connection for organizing this event, and especially to Denny for your hospitality, and to Nedra, who I don't know if she's here, but did so much administrative work to make this happen. I just really appreciate it. Sort of looking out today, I will note that the audience for today's talk is much different than I'm used to. In my capacity as a professor, I didn't say it, at York, and as a sort of researcher in the fields of communication and media studies, I'm most often talking to students who are in their 20s and who are really interested in how their ability to master digital technology or in how they might critique digital technology might lead them to getting jobs in a few years. And I feel that sort of stress from them every day. Or I'm talking to other researchers who are already very deeply critical of the increasing power of our digital technologies, and we're sort of working together to try to track this sort of power. So I'm really excited for this opportunity to talk to all of you, and I hope I will sort of do justice to this topic. Before I sort of turn to the topic for today's talk, which is going to really focus on educational technologies, I'll just tell you a little bit about my research, and so you sort of have an idea of the approach I'm coming to the talk with. But I'm not going to focus today on this sort of long research project I've had, which is mostly about sort of race and gender and technology, although it will be sort of peppered through the talk today because I can't help it. Yeah, so I'm a professor at York in the Communication and Media Studies department. I began this job in 2021. So I became a professor when most universities were still teaching remotely. I started my job just 4 years ago, and since then we've had this massive introduction of things like user-generated AI enter the classroom. And so every day I'm sort of in meetings and faced with these issues about how we're going to deal with emerging technologies. So from remote learning technologies like Zoom to the proliferation of learning management systems, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And this is places where professors store and disseminate class material, to AI being used by our students. I've had this front row seat, like all professors have, to a rapid change in education technologies. At the same time, I'm also a media theorist who centers things like race and gender in my readings of emerging technologies. I've just finished writing my first single-authored book, which, as Denny said, is called Platform Feminism and the Politics of Elevation, and that will come out with Minnesota University Press. And that book outlines a sort of politics of platforms and argues that I think we take for granted or assume a political utility of platforms, which have often been presented to us as being sort of democratizing media. But if we pay attention to the way that Black and brown and queer and trans people are using the internet, we might find that these technologies are not so democratizing. And my work has really been indebted to traditional media theory. So, for instance, I heavily draw. I think I might have missed a slide there. Yep. I draw really heavily on people like Marshall McLuhan and Harold Adams Innes in my research. You might recognize these names. They are not media scholars who think about race and gender, and I don't think they would have claimed they do, and most people wouldn't. But they matter for my work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's the case. This is reflected in both my work on platforms and in a co-edited book that I wrote with Sarah Sharma, who's a professor at U of T and used to be the director of what was then called the McLuhan Center for Culture and Technology. That name has since been stripped, and now it's just the Institute for Culture and Technology. That book, called Re-Understanding Media, offers this sort of feminist approach to Marshall McLuhan's theories of media, and it makes the argument that we can think about people or use people like McLuhan and Innes, Canadian media studies scholars, to make sense of gender and race, even if they didn't intend for us to do that. That's the cover of the book. Okay. So McLuhan and Innes, again, are names that are probably recognizable to you, and it's because they're these media theorists that gave us a really expansive notion of what a technology actually is. And they developed this theory of media that shows us how our technologies structure the world. McLuhan specifically was really focused on media forms and not media content. So for example, if McLuhan were alive today and offering us a reading of social media platforms like Facebook, he would say we don't need to focus, or we shouldn't care so much about the sorts of posts people are making, right? What photos they're sharing, that's media content. And more on the structuring effects of a platform and what it means when Facebook is sort of introduced into our technological environment. So if we're thinking about Facebook as a platform that structures the world, we're instead making arguments about how these sort of understandings of the ease of speaking up are structured or introduced by the platform, right? So it's a shift on what it means that Facebook exists in the first place and not in what we're sharing on Facebook. McLuhan famously told us that media can alter the pace, pattern, and scale of social and political life. And this is a line of thinking that I'm going to carry throughout this talk today as we start thinking about education technologies. Okay, so what I'm going to do with my time here is present a case for why and how we need to rethink the role of education technologies in the digital age. So this talk is going to happen in 2 parts, and I guess if you count what I just did, 3 parts. The first is going to lay out what's at stake when privately owned digital platforms take over our education systems and how we might interrupt these narratives of technological progress that have seeped into popular discourse about our technologies. So what I really want you to sort of take away from the next 35 minutes is that we can actually rethink edtech so that it isn't positioned as a sort of tool that we pick up and put down, but as a structuring media that changes the environment it's being introduced in. So I'm going to start by defining what education technology actually is, which is also, and throughout this talk, will be referred to as EdTech. So very broadly, EdTech is any technology that is used in schools to aid learning. So under this definition, we can see that there's actually a really long history of technology being central to the way that learning and teaching happens. The abacus, blackboards, chalk, film, and educational programming that have been showed in classrooms are all examples of EdTech, both analog and not, because they are technologies that would have altered how a teacher educates their students. So we could take the abacus here, for example. This is a tool that aids children in mastering mental health and calculation skills. Children learn to visualize numbers and perform mental calculations by manipulating the beads on an abacus. This approach enhances their speed and accuracy in calculations. It improves overall mathematical abilities, although I have a toddler and I'm not sure that's true. Children become more proficient in using the abacus. They develop a profound understanding of number patterns and relationships, enabling them to easily solve complex mathematical problems. So I'm bringing up this example here, and don't worry, this is not going to be a talk on the abacus, but I'm bringing up this example to show you that EdTech has a longer history than we might assume, that often comes up in worries or celebrations about the ways that technology has entered the classroom, right? Education itself is built on different technologies. But of course, you're not here for me to talk about this history, but instead to think about the kind of EdTech that's come to dominate public discourse and academic critique today, which comprises of a sort of mix of online learning platforms, virtual classrooms, and increasingly AI. The proliferation of these technologies has really accelerated across all sectors of education, so I mean K-12 education and colleges and universities since COVID-19, when teachers and professors alike were forced to adapt to teaching remotely. The pandemic accelerated the already steady growth of the use and then dependence on digital tech. The value of the global EdTech market in 2021 was $106.46 billion, and that's just the beginning. From 2022 to 2030, this market is expected to grow annually by 16.5% and is expected to expand 2.5 times from 2019 to 2015, up to $404 billion in 2025. Right, so we can see how the sort of current landscape of EdTech is pretty unstoppable. It's a force that is restructuring what it means to be a student and a teacher in the digital age. One of the most pervasive pieces of EdTech are called learning management systems, or LMS for short. And these are things like Moodle or Canvas or Blackboard. Maybe you've seen your kids or grandkids, or maybe you yourself have encountered these at some point. These are platforms where materials like readings for a course, or lecture slides or lecture recordings are stored. This is an infrastructure where we administer online tests to our students, where we upload our grades. It's around 2005 when universities begin investing in these platforms and integrate the software into schools' information technology and staffing infrastructure. And today, you won't work or find a university that's not using an LMS. Most are using Blackboard. LMS were introduced with the promise of doing things like improving course accessibility to students, decreasing labor for teachers, allowing more standardized course management across large infrastructures or institutions. Right, so these are software that are sold on the premise of being convenient for everyone. Kate Maddalena, who's a professor at U of T in the Institute for Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology, argues that despite the conveniences of learning management technologies, they might also be read as technologies of late capitalist oppressions. She writes that LMS products are tools of surveillance capitalism that have introduced automated culture into higher education, enabling institutions to sell education in bulk while reducing the presence of living, embodied teachers and students. This argument can be vivified, for example, if we look at the amount of data that's collected when a student engages or when they do not with learning management systems. So here's a screen capture of a list of students for one of the courses I'm teaching at York right now. I've cropped out the names and email addresses in case you have a family member in one of my courses here. But you can see exactly when students were last online and sometimes how long they spend on the platform, right? So I know that one of my stronger students was online 38 minutes ago, and I know this guy who's never shown up has also never logged in, right? And he's definitely gonna ask for an extension, right? So this system allows me to watch student behavior, right, to see if they're doing the readings, engage with course material as they should be. Professors use this as a way often of punishing their students, right? They think about a student logging online when they're going to decide if they're going to grant a course extension or believe that a family member has died, right? These things come into the back of our minds when we're making judgments about how good a student is. I think the problem here is that this is a form of surveillance that students have no idea about. They don't know how much information a professor has, or how, or why, or if a student or a professor is actually going to use this information, right, to be punishing or rewarding. This is a sort of data collection that is also an example of what's called surveillance capitalism. Shoshana Zuboff, who's a professor at Harvard University, coined this term. And she defines surveillance capitalism as the unilateral claiming of private human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data. These data are then computed and packaged as prediction products and sold into behavioral future markets. Business customers with commercial interests in knowing what we will do now, soon, and later. All learning management systems are privately owned companies with the goal of turning a profit. That's probably obvious. But they do this both by selling their systems to universities, and maybe more importantly for this discussion of surveillance capitalism, by reselling the data of students who use the systems. So Tanner Miralise, who's a professor of communication just down the road at the Ontario Tech University, puts it this way. He says that the learner's pursuit of knowledge, the social life of learning, is monitored, converted into data, mined for demographic insights, and monetized by big data. Right, so the problem with the way that learning management systems are being used in North America, and again, this is what we can understand as the most widespread form of ed tech, is that the students who are being watched have no opportunity to object to this kind of surveillance if they want to succeed in their courses, right? LMSs have structured the way courses are run. Students access readings, they submit work, they receive grades, they take tests on these platforms. Educational environments are structured by ed tech platforms through and through so that there's never a moment when opting out is actually available to them. So aside from surveillance, a second major issue that is at the center of critique around ed tech is how it's used to extract knowledge and labor from professors. This was an issue that was exacerbated for sure during the COVID-19 pandemic when all professors were ordered to quickly pivot to teaching online. Many of us, as a requirement set out by the institutions we work for, suddenly began recording lectures and posting them on learning management systems. The Zoom room, a suite of cheap mics we bought off Amazon all at once, stage lighting, stand-up desks replaced the podium or the head of a small table in seminar rooms. When our recorded lectures were loaded to the university, all of a sudden the university owned this intellectual property and could repurpose recorded lectures however they wanted. Tamara Neese, who's author of a book called Death Glitch, How Techno-Solutionism Fails Us in This Life and Beyond, wonders, will faculty essentially automate away their own jobs by recording lectures that can be recycled year after year? Letting that one linger. So this was a worry that's been held by many university professors and was highlighted perhaps most largely for many of us when news broke in 2021 that students at Concordia University were enrolled in and taking an online class from an art history professor, Francois-Marc Gagnon, who had actually been dead since 2019. A student in that class learned that he was being taught by a dead man when he looked up the professor's email to ask him a question about course material and found an obituary instead. So while Gagnon's course had actually been online since 2019, so it predates the COVID era, the influx of this sort of online course being offered still raises questions about how the introduction of EdTech into university and other educational settings sort of remakes the role of the professor. The proliferation of EdTech that began in 2020 makes it seem as though professors are content creators, and obscures the other sorts of labor that we do that's so integral to learning well, like having meaningful conversations in classes or offering care to our students. At a moment in time when professors are increasingly expected to be able to record lectures and upload them to learning management systems, we have this moment, right, where we're presupposing that we're content creators and not connectors. I think of a moment from this past academic year that really highlights to me how this is a problem. In the fall, I was teaching a graduate seminar on race and gender in technology at York University. All of my students in that class, they're all MA and PhD students, were Black and brown or queer. This course ran on Wednesdays, and it just so happened to fall the day after Donald Trump was elected president for the second time. When I entered the classroom that day, I could feel the heaviness in the room. My students and I were afraid. We couldn't believe that millions of people had voted for this guy to become president again when he had so outwardly expressed hatred toward people that look like us. Right? And so that day we spent the entire seminar talking about how we had arrived at this moment because of digital technology, but also how we might use our technologies to resist or to care for people who were about to find life a lot harder to live. And so I understand my job as an educator to include responding to the political moment and showing students how to become responsible digital citizens. And this is a part of the job that gets totally obscured when we start focusing on educational technologies, right? EdTech platforms in this case restructure the university so that there's an assumption that we can easily move online, that we don't need to be in a room with our students, that a dead professor can deliver content just as well as anyone else. And finally, a new sort of pressing issue, and one that maps directly onto the theme of your NLC speaker series today, is the introduction of AI in classrooms. And this is an area of EdTech that is certainly growing the quickest, and it's an issue that has gained the most attention in the past few years. It's probably why, as you're the organizers of this event, were thinking they needed to include EdTech in the series. New tools and products are emerging, offering the promise of making education more efficient. The underlying logic that underpins the introduction of AI in education is a push toward automation. It's reflective of a value system that privileges efficiency and productivity above all else. There's many ways that AI has entered the classroom. For instance, educational solutions such as AI teaching assistants are proposed to reduce educators' workload. These teaching assistants are generative AI technologies to help with what some might call sort of mindless administrative tasks. And this is especially being used in the sort of K-12 setting. So these are things like helping write emails or generating test questions or creating lesson plans. So the introduction of generative AI to assist teachers comes at this moment when there's been a ton of attention paid to teachers' workloads, right? Worries about things like burnout or teacher retention, the spilling over of labor outside of work hours. So we can see why the tech industry, which has always been so intent on providing technological fixes to everyday problems, might be really invested in offering solutions to this problem, and why school boards might be attracted to alleviating the labor of their overworked teachers. I think that this is actually an instance where technology, and here I mean generative AI, is offered as a surface level solution when there's much more sort of structural issues at hand that actually need to be addressed, right? So a focus here on AI in education means we're ignoring the fact that teachers are underpaid or overworked, for instance. And we know that historically, when technology are introduced as a way of solving problems without dealing with the actual structural issue at hand, inequalities continue to be perpetuated. So you could take, for instance, the research of feminist media studies scholar Ruth Schwartz-Cowan, for instance. She wrote this sort of incredible field-defining book in the 80s called More Work for Mother. And in this book, she argues that historically, technological innovation has privileged men rather than women. So for instance, innovations such as cast iron stoves or municipal water or manufactured boots freed men from chopping wood, hauling water, and tanning leather and making shoes. Men could take wage jobs instead, leaving women at home to work in their traditional tasks. So we see how these early technologies were designed to privilege the sorts of labor we consider to be masculine, and we've designed our technologies to make it more possible for men to work outside of the home, right? The aim of technology in this case was always to free men from doing domestic labor. Later, though, and this is Schwartz-Cowan's argument, we see that technologies that were meant to sort of assist with domestic labor tied to women's work, so here irons or washing machines, had the sort of opposite effect. They didn't free women of doing this work, right? They just made it possible for them to do this kind of work at home faster, so that they could do more domestic labor, right? So her argument is that although advances in technology and industrialization affecting the home reduced the total amount of work necessary to maintain a household, it only reduced work for men. As modern technological systems for the home developed, they created more work, more isolation, increased social expectations for wives and mothers. And I think we can apply this reading to generative AI in teaching today. We might ask if the labor of teachers will actually be reduced via AI, and what other kinds of labor might then be introduced instead, right? If we're not concerned that teachers aren't being paid enough, we might say like, hey, teachers have more time now on their weekends because their AI is writing their emails. What else can we get them to do? Aside from generative AI for teachers, we know that students are using AI to complete their coursework. From the use of ChatGPT to generate essays, to language and Grammarly assistants like Grammarly, there's this growing list of generative AI that students can use to cheat. Universities have had to be really swift in developing methods for detecting the use of AI and for coming up with policies that professors should adopt. There's some really easy ways of doing this, things that I might employ in my classes, like developing assignments that require students to build on previous work throughout the term so that you can actually track their work in progress. You can ask students to produce not just a final product, right, so an essay, but hand in things like research notes or paper outlines or drafts. All these are things that might safeguard against the use of ChatGPT. Students can be asked to complete in-class learning assignments so that you can see how a student actually writes and then compare their writing samples. Some professors will take time to do ChatGPT demonstrations in class to show how ridiculous some of the answers are, and then ask students if they think that's like a smart way to cheat. And one of the other major ways that professors are meeting students with the use of AI is, if you can believe it, with more AI. Right, so for instance, Turnitin is a similarity detection service that many universities provide professors. When students hand in any work, it runs through this Turnitin platform. Turnitin is the world's largest provider of academic integrity software, and it's being used across North America, both in universities and in high schools. And nearly all scholarly journals are now using Turnitin, so when I submit a paper I've just written or my book, it also runs through Turnitin. I think there's two sort of good causes to hesitate or feel worried about the widespread adoption of Turnitin too. First, in May 2023, the Washington Post published an article that showed how reporters had tested a new ChatGPT detector developed by Turnitin and found that the technology was inaccurate. Students who had not used AI to write their papers were flagged. So even a small amount of inaccuracy could result in major issues for students who might be wrongfully accused of plagiarism, right? They can be expelled, they might lose their grants, right? Things that help them live. Second, we're increasingly seeing instances of Turnitin being used as a political weapon. For instance, in the States, right-wing activists have employed Turnitin on ex-Harvard University president Claudine Gay in her previously published work. No one's accused Gay of stealing data or high-level ideas, but some of her work appears to contain expository sentences that were close enough to other sources that she was flagged. These accusations actually led to Gay's eventual resignation and ended the tenure of Harvard's first Black president less than 6 months after it began. Right, so we see through the example of the Post story that revealed that Turnitin isn't always accurate, or through Gay's resignation, that ChatGPT and AI detection software is not neutral or value-free, and that the results that it produces aren't always accurate and again, can be interpreted in ways that are quite punishing. I think these are imperfect solutions. They are what we have in this moment. But I want to suggest that these solutions also need to be paired with an ethic of care by educators. We need a total view of the conditions our students are living in, especially when many are living in a state of multiple crises at once. Our current environment is already structured by the introduction of various technologies, social media, platforms like Amazon and Google, Silicon bros like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, which have made life harder to live for so many. So instead of focusing our fears and anxieties on whether or not our students are going to misuse AI, I wonder if instead it might be more useful to think about why our students are using these things in the first place and what we can do to help them. Are students looking for shortcuts because they are working multiple jobs at once to pay for their education, having housing crises? They're worried about the future because of an ecological emergency or the threat of authoritarianism or declining mental health. In many ways, tech has accelerated and made these conditions more intense, so I think we need to actually understand that there isn't a technological solution to these problems, and that there's actually only approaching our students with care. Okay, so I'm gonna have some water and then switch gears. Okay, so this is part 2 of the talk, and I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. So far, I've presented a view of ed tech as largely imperfect. I've shown you how these technologies alter what it means to be an educator in the digital age, and why many educators are weary about the rapid adoption of a myriad of education technologies. I think this begs the question about why and how universities, arguably or supposedly full of smart and critical thinkers, have been so willing to adopt ed tech at such a rapid rate. There might be a few answers to this, but for me, I think the answer can be found in thinking about the concept of progress. And we think about or talk about progress and technology as being directly related. And certainly ed tech has been sold to educators and to the general public as a sign of progress. But media theorists have been really invested in complicating the relationship between technology and progress. So I'm going to take you through that sort of theory. I'm going to start by defining progress, which I do for my students and probably don't need to do here. But very simply, progress means to move forward, right? Progress implies a direction, a move toward a goal or a desired end. Media theorists Slack and Wise tell us that the goals of progress usually match the fundamental values of a society. So if we value, for example, speed and efficiency, which the Western world certainly does, then we might think about the fact that our Wi-Fi networks have never been faster is a sign of progress. We also know, of course, in this example that progress is complicated. It's usually happening unequally, right? Not everyone has access to the same sort of speed. And a sort of dominant or popular understanding of technology tells us that technological innovation equals societal progress. And Slack and Wise tell us that this is because of 2 things. First, it's because we think of technology as things, right? So we accept that more things equals progress. It's easily measurable. So society, the idea or the story goes that society must be progressing if we have more innovation, right? So if you think about something stupid like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank here, right? They sell us the idea that innovation or the introduction of just more objects is necessarily good. And second, we have this idea that technology increases efficiency and rationality. Again, these are 2 things that I think most people value, right? So here we see why we get the adoption of things like AI and big data, right? These are things that are sold to us as progressive because they help us make better decisions, or at least they should. And so how do we come to think about technology as a symbol of progress? This hasn't always been the case. Leo Marx, who's a science and technology philosopher, argues that when we began our Western commitment to technology as progress, it was during the Enlightenment period. He argues that we can point back to a dominant American or Western worldview that assumes that history is driven by the steady, cumulative, and inevitable expansion of human knowledge and of power over nature. New scientific knowledge and technological power was expected to make possible a comprehensive improvement in all life conditions, in all conditions of life, social, political, moral, and intellectual, as well as material. Right, so beginning in the 1700s, progress is sort of thought of as our ability, in terms of our ability to use technology to command nature, but it was also thought of insofar as it was helpful in improving social and political and moral life, right? So tech removed from these things wasn't considered to be actually meaningful to human progress. And we can think of the railroad as an early example here of technological progress. So when passenger railroads in the UK and the US began in the 1830s, it's just as captivating as the home computer would be many decades later. Steam engines could move more weight more quickly than anyone at the time could imagine. The railroad helped humans conquer time and space. It made it possible to travel large distances, to move essential goods. It remade space and introduced things like city centers and corridors. This was a symbol of progress that brought with it political and social changes to the way life was lived for many humans. But even this kind of beacon of progress, right, the most famous example of tech in progress, is complicated when we think about how it also colonized space or degraded the environment or privileged the mobility of some over others. So even early formations of tech in progress, those we so often celebrate, we should maybe rethink them, right? And think about a big question, which is progress for who? And we can make sense of this by looking at the painting American Progress by John Gast, which is, I think, 1862. So American Progress visually portrays the process of American westward expansion. We have the figure of Columbia ushering in an era of modernization, development, and advancement in the West, which in the painting is just portrayed as a dark and savage place, especially when compared to the eastern side of the painting. But with the ushering in of these developments, the indigenous people living in the West and their way of life is cast out. So we have this understanding of how the West started to think about progress as being directly tied to technology. And let's remember that key to this is that initially and during the Enlightenment period, technology was only a part of the story, or a part of the story of progress if it was tied to making conditions of life better, morally, politically, culturally. But as Leo Marx has pointed out, and as you might have concluded, we've sort of moved on from thinking about progress in terms of moral and political improvements, right? So instead, since the development of industrial capitalism, we've simply celebrated technology in and of itself. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Right, so this sort of makes sense if you think about the state we're in now, right? We don't necessarily talk about or think about our new iPhones and the features it has in terms of political liberation. No one's making that argument. Instead, its new features are enough for us to consider that these technologies are innovative and signs of Western progress. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this history of the relationship between tech and progress with two important takeaways for understanding the history of the concept of progress. One, during the Enlightenment, belief in technological and scientific progress was because it was in the service of political liberation. And two, today we think technology is a symbol of progress in and of itself. Its social implications actually tend to matter less. So EdTech has been sold to us, and by us I mean not just educators, but the general public, as technological progress. Tanner Mirrlees has argued that the story of EdTech is a story saturated with words like disruption, efficiency, relevance, innovation, standardization, calculability, productivity, right? These are all words that tech bros use all the time. EdTech in all of its forms is technological progress that hasn't properly taken into account the social implications or the way it might restructure what it means to teach in the digital age. What if we privilege these words less and thought about how education needs to be careful, responsible, and thoughtful, creative instead? EdTech isn't going anywhere. It's too profitable. It's too ingrained in how educational institutions function today. But to me, that doesn't mean that the values we hold are unchangeable. In an age that is structured by digital technologies, we might think about how we can focus on making our lives more livable for students. So I began this talk with a very long and unnecessary description of the abacus. This isn't something I needed to do because I think you all know what an abacus is. It's an ed tech that's so deeply ingrained in how we learn that it's become a part of our technological environment. Education has always been shaped by the technological, by the abacus, by chalk. This isn't a bad thing in and of itself. We need to not fear technology. We only need to orient or reorient around the sorts of futures we want to see. Okay.
Thank you, Rianka. Yeah, I think you got to stand up here. I know that our audience is going to have a lot of questions. I have to tell you, as a former educator, everything that you said really hit home, and I really wish some of the people who are in charge of the schools I taught in would think about the structural changes of the technology, because my job changed from being somebody who cared for students to somebody who had to perform and create material, and I had very little time left for those human connections, and we all know that's what kids need most now. So thank you for validating that, and all these parents and grandparents, I expect, might have some questions for you about EdTech and how it relates to their families.
Thank you. I really appreciate everything you had to say. And I'm wondering, since we are living in late capitalism, do you know of any analog alternatives that are popping up? I can imagine there's a niche market for educators, maybe who are doing it purely for the profit, but to offer an alternative that would sway away from that or purposefully dismantle that.
Yeah, sure. I can think of one sort of example. So I was hired to work at Markham's, York's new Markham campus, which is this campus that is about tech, right? It looks, the classrooms look like startups. It's, someone described it as like the Cybertruck of university campuses, just to sort of give you, give you a picture of that. And the program that I developed there is one about social media and public relations. And the new chair of that program, Nick Taylor, is someone who focuses on Lego. His media of choice is Lego. So if I'm studying platforms, he's thinking about Lego. And in all of his classes, he brings Lego sets and has his students build with them to think about how Lego are media, right? What sorts of worlds they might mediate. They talk about how Lego could be social media, right? What kind of connections they bring. It's just a really strange thing to be doing in a Cybertruck of a campus, right? To think about Lego, but I think there's people who are creative and starting to do that, and often they're media studies scholars who already have this sort of expansive notion of what technology actually is.
Our previous speaker last week talked about the responsibilities that we have of using technology. And one of the things he brought up was these algorithms that nobody understands. And I am totally powerless to find out what they are. And the question that I have for you is, there seems to be a huge responsibility on the part of the people who develop these algorithms to disclose them to the public. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. So you're asking, I guess, about like algorithmic transparency?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think this is interesting because we're in a moment where actually platform owners are making their algorithms quite transparent to us, right? Elon Musk is someone who's making this information knowable. Mark Zuckerberg told us that you can't talk about trans people on Facebook anymore, right? They're actually now telling us exactly what they're doing. and yet there's still no resistance to it. Like, we know that people were made to follow Trump and J.D. Vance on social media, even if they didn't decide to, and they weren't shy about it. So I actually think our conversation maybe needs to shift from being concerned about algorithmic transparency, because they're not being obtuse anymore, they don't care, and towards something else, right? Like, what is the resistance to the fact that these platforms are making us, or literally making us shift our attention toward the right? That's how I feel. I think 6 months ago my my answer might have been different, but they've shifted. They've changed what they're doing. They're not hiding anymore because they don't have to.
Rianka, maybe for this group, it would be really useful to define an algorithm.
Okay.
In very basic terms, how it works,
Yeah. Okay.
how what you looked at will influence what you get to see next.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So an algorithm is sort of what a platform. Okay, algorithms can be many things, right? It's a mathematical equation, but I'll back up by saying many people have argued an algorithm is also a recipe for cooking, right? Like that's an example of an algorithm, right? It's a list of instructions that leads you to an end result. Okay, so when we're thinking about algorithms on platforms, I think part of the worry that Jesse probably was bringing up last week is that we don't know what these lists of ingredients are. We only know what the final dish looks like. Yeah. So this has been at the sort of forefront of worries about technology because when we don't know what an algorithm is, we don't know why all of a sudden our kids have been watching Joe Rogan on YouTube for like 6 hours, right? We don't know how they got to this point where all of a sudden their political leanings have changed. But what's happened, because not just academic people, but because the general public is so interested in algorithms, is what I was saying before. They're not hiding what they're doing anymore, right? They're pretty obtuse, or pretty transparent about the fact that we are pushing you toward a particular kind of politics, but also politics from the left are not acceptable on these platforms. So if pre-2020, when we have January 6th, all of a sudden Trump's not allowed on these platforms, today he's not only allowed, but his agenda is centered, right? Even if we don't want to see it. So I think that our discussion has to shift because it's not a secret anymore. So what do we do knowing it's not a secret, right?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Someone there, and then
Before I ask my question, I just want to make sure that you know that you're being recorded and it'll
Yeah.
be on YouTube. And long after you're dead, this will seem very prescient.
I'm going to a Boston Celtics game next Tuesday, so if you could wait to release this before, it's okay.
My question is to ask you if you could comment on the fact that generally we believe that because we have a lot more information that it's accurate and truthful, but it's not.
Yeah, so your question is just about disinformation and how to parse it, is that right? Yeah, I mean, okay, so I think where I sort of ended this talk by saying that we might decenter technology and think about things like care. We might also think about truth too. And I actually think that we don't need to throw out the technological in helping us arrive at moments of truth, right? Like AI is actually could potentially, if we used it properly, be useful for helping us arrive at the truth, right? We could think about how if Google chose to, they might. It might, right, help us arrive at the truth that they actually have the power and ability to do these things, and that if our sort of agenda changes away from the technology and toward a particular set of values, truth, care, the survival of people who are different, right, we might actually continue to use our technologies, but just differently. In the book I've just written, I talk a lot about how queer and black and brown people use technology even when it's hostile to them because they have to, right? There's no choice. They like, this is the world we're living in. But they use technology to do things quietly, right? To share information, to pass goods to each other when they're out of money, right? Things like that. So if we orient ourselves toward the technological with a certain set of values, I think that, you know, like having more information isn't necessarily bad, even if that's the way the conversation about misinformation has like pointed us lately. But that's tough, and I don't know.
Yeah, as I understand it, the reason we don't have transparency is perhaps not so much because of the algorithms, but because it's a massive network of correlations. So it's functioning a little bit like a neural network. So if we could sort of think of the algorithms as being in a human brain, what makes a cell work and what makes it create connections between other cells and emphasize connections, that's the algorithm. But if you have input of somebody seeing something and then saying what they see, trying to explain how they got to the input to the output is you know, that's the problem of explaining consciousness, which we can't really do. So I think when we're talking about the obscurity of how the AIs work, is that we can't look into the AI and figure out what that network of correlations is. We just know that there is a network of correlations that produced a reliable output, if I've got it right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
I don't have a question.
Okay.
Well,
I don't know. I didn't know if I missed it. I didn't know if I missed it.
I can segue to a question because I do have this. Do we have a problem with AIs becoming a received view? So ChatGPT has a received view of the world, but each of us individually grew up in variously encultured with our own individual experiences. So what we might have, in fact, do you think, is perhaps a tyranny of the majority of knowledge coming from the AIs that don't reflect our individual lived experiences? But maybe that is an advantage for us because we do have individual lived experiences that AIs can't respond to, and so that is our niche, our human niche in the future.
I mean, cultural studies theorists or people who have studied sort of media and power would tell you that power has sort of always fed us our sort of culture in different ways, right? So people like Stuart Hall, who you I don't know, may have read about at some point, who's a pretty important cultural theorist, tells us that power has always been interested in feeding us a particular message or view of the world, and that people have often had a really difficult time sort of parsing it, right? So those people would tell you that this is just AI's part of a longer media history of our ideas being dictated by power and fed through various media, right? AI is just another form of media, albeit probably scarier with more money, moving at faster rates, but still sort of dictated by the same power, right? States, white dudes with money, sorry, right? Right? This has always been the thing that's the people who have decided what we should like, what being good looks like, right? And that we have always been disciplined by our media. You know, that's how I would maybe respond to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. AIs are taking up what's common information. So, for example, if you ask an AI to illustrate a swan, it's always going to give you a white swan.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what's common.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think like if in the past we asked our TV to show us what a good family looks like, it looks like a white family with a mom and a dad and people with middle-class jobs, right? Like, hasn't our media always sort of reflected back a particular set of values?
Hi, everybody. I am a former teacher, former educator, and when I first started teaching, like I'm sure there are many in this room who are former educators or educators now, what we were taught was to identify what the goal was for the education. I think that this has been lost in our society. And my question is, how do we do what you want to do with this presentation? How do we swing that pendulum back again and away from technology and learn that and remember that technology is a tool? The blackboard was a tool. The TV was a tool. It wasn't what we were trying to do to educate through these tools. We were educating through the tools, and our goal was to bring these students along to make a better life for themselves and for everybody else. We've lost track of that. We've lost the focus. We have to remember that these technologies are tools, and we need to use these tools. We need to get involved with using these tools, as we are very fortunate in our society that we, as human beings and parents and educators, have an opportunity to go to your trustee and say, look, this is not what we need to be doing here. Yes, let's learn how to use the tools. Let's teach our students how to use the tools. But let's keep our eye on the ball here and make sure that these students are learning what is most important in life, and that is to love and encourage and be respectful of people. People are the most important here, not technology. Technology we can use as a tool, but remember the people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question that maybe many of you were here in 2019 when we did a program on China. And I remember one of the speakers said that they, in the tracking software that they used with the Face ID, the recognition software, and all the CCTVs that were everywhere, they could tell how much time we were spending reading Xi's writings. And when I came in here tonight, I thought you were going to tell us about how students were cheating by using AI. And you've flipped the story. It's about how educators are being forced to fail their students by commoditizing their learning. That's a big lesson for all of us. Oh, here.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions.
Is that dead professor still being paid?
No.
Someone here, Don?
Okay.
Good one.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so very much for your presentation. I don't want to play devil's advocate exactly, but I teach in a graduate program, and most of my teaching is done on Zoom. We don't use Blackboard, even though we are very encouraged to do so. I teach inductively, working from cases, and the teaching takes place when we are together as a learning community. And Zoom makes it possible for people who are working, for people who would not have access to universities to get together. We had a student from Hawaii join us. We were all envious. But I just think that, as I say, nothing is recorded. Everything happens in the moment, and we create a learning community. There's no waiting room.
Yeah.
And we start by checking in each week. And people who are never going to meet each other in person connect. And what we need right now is connection. And I'm just wondering, are there other ways that you can think of that technology can facilitate connection like this?
Yeah, I don't want to. Right. So when I'm saying that we need to do things like privilege care, I think this is an example, right? I also think about disabled students, right, or immunocompromised students who couldn't come to class, and so our ability to sort of teach hybrid made it possible for them to continue learning. I think this is an example of the sort of shift toward care that I'm talking about, right? It's not a focus on the technology. It isn't technology is good or bad. It's saying it's structuring the conditions that we work in. Yeah, and I think the question of like what are other examples is a good one, and one that I knew I would get, and that I've been, sort of like stewing on last night when I couldn't sleep, right? So one thing I was thinking about is the way that a lot of students, or a lot of my trans students, are using AI to generate images of what they might look like if they got the surgery they want, right? So they use AI to envision what it might look like not to have a chest, right? Or to have a beard if they're were born female, right? So I think that there are ways to think about how technology, or how AI specifically, or the Zoom room, right, enables the sort of care I care about, right? And I'm also interested, like, where do you teach that isn't using Blackboard? And are they hiring? Oh, you are not. Yeah. Yeah, okay. You can't be, pre-tenure.
I just wanted to touch on the same thing. I started teaching, and one of the lesson plans I was having a hard time with, so I went to another teacher, and he would not share his best practice on a certain topic, where now you can find any lesson plan on any topic anywhere on the internet. I don't think we are ever going to stop the progression of technology, the use of AI in classrooms, in our day-to-day life, and just even the fob on the car has just changed my life. I don't have to touch my keys. They stay in my purse all the time. Like, there's so many advantages of AI. I think we just have to keep going back